In regards to the current crisis in Syria, what failures can be attributed to humanitarian aid?
In general, the implementation of humanitarian aid within the current crisis in Syria has not been as effective or as fervent as most people would have expected it to be. It wasn't until March 26, 2012, a full year after the beginning of violence in Syria, that the SARG accepted a 6-point peace plan proposed by UN Arab League Special Envoy to Syria, Kofi Annan. The plan called for a ceasefire, unrestricted humanitarian access, and the withdrawal of military personnel from populated areas. However, the ceasefire never actually took effect due to clashes between Assad's forces and the opposition in Syria. Then on August 2nd, Kofi Annan announced his resignation as UN Arab League Special Envoy to Syria, deeming the task he had once accepted as mission impossible. And this clearly took a large toll on the humanitarian aid in Syria just because organization was completely thrown off now that the leader of the entire envoy is stepping down. Louay Hussein, a Syrian writer and opposition activist, said that the responsibility of the failure of Mr. Annan and his mission is the responsibility of the international community and not the Syrian parties to the conflict. It will have very negative consequences on the armed conflict in the country, and this is according to the New York Times. As you can see, it's not just from the perspective of humanitarian aid when it comes to NGOs, but it's like the international community that has struggled to provide aid to Syria and actually get involved in the conflict in itself. On November 9th, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Population and Refugees and Migration, Kelly Clements, announced that the United States government is actually going to provide more than $34 million in additional humanitarian assistance to help those affected by the conflict in Syria. The assistance includes more than $5.6 million to non-governmental organizations in order to provide for winter relief supplies and other basic necessities inside Syria within the coming months. Nearly $16.7 million will go to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to assist all the Syrians displaced to Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, the surrounding nations. $9 million to the UN Children's Fund, because most of the refugees within Syria right now are women and children who have already been persecuted within the country itself before seeking refuge. $2 million to the UN World Food Program, and $400,000 to the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, which is the Middle Eastern version of the Red Cross, and $323,000 to the UN Population Fund. Although all this money is being pumped into these different organizations, it's very difficult to gain access to the populations in need within Syria, so a lot of this money is actually going to waste, which has a lot to do with the failure of humanitarian aid within the crisis itself right now. As conflict continues, UN agencies estimate that an additional 1.5 million people in Syria may be in need of assistance in the coming months, especially within the coming winter months, because weather is actually going to play a factor within the crisis right now. This raises the number of conflict-affected people due to the Syrian revolution from 2.5 million to 4 million people. According to the EU Humanitarian Affairs Commissioner Kristina Georgieva, to do more we need more access in Syria, which is the main problem right now. After talks on the issue with heads of the UN and other international aid agencies at the UN General Assembly in New York, Georgieva said that this is an urban war, which makes it difficult for aid to be distributed due to roadblocks in different cities, such as Homs and Daraa in Syria. The European Union provided $287 million for humanitarian efforts in Syria, Georgieva said, but only 38% of UN funding appeal has been met. According to Reuters, the U.S. edition, the revised Syria humanitarian aid response plan seeks $348 million in funding. Of funds received, more than 20% has been allocated from the OCHA Central Emergency Response Fund. The main problem with humanitarian aid in Syria right now is the fact that access is not being guaranteed for different humanitarian aid organizations such as NGOs and other nonprofit organizations. And the main way that we can help this problem is by adding more funding in order to get both sides of the conflict to agree to be neutral when it comes to humanitarian aid.
What factors can be accredited the growing problem with refugees when it comes to the revolution?
Well, with the winter season quickly approaching, the number in need of assistance in Syria is very likely to rise. Tens of thousands of IDPs are staying temporarily in buildings that are completely unsuitable for the cold of winter, because winter actually does play a factor within Syria. Even though it is a Middle Eastern country, there is somewhat a change of season. This means that these IDPs will most commonly seek refuge outside of Syria in the coming months if this is at all accessible. Also, Syria currently hosts 518,000 Palestinian refugees due to the consistent conflict of the Palestinian state with that of Israel. And according to the UNRWA, about 40% of this refugee population has been displaced as a result of the current crisis. Therefore, around 42,000 Palestinian refugee familiars have requested cash assistance. And to respond to such needs, the UNRWA has launched a revised response plan amounting to $44 million in US dollars. So money is going to play a huge role in the refugee crisis as well as the humanitarian aid crisis. As the magnitude of the crisis in Syria continues to increase, the repercussions are felt in neighboring countries where the overall refugee population has reached more than 408,000 people, which is a wild number compared to what was expected of the refugee situation in Syria. By early 2013, the number of the refugees is expected to reach around 710,000 people. And given that there's 408,000 Syrian refugees, this does not include the Syrians who have fled the country without registering, which may be in the tens of thousands in some of the surrounding countries, which means that the problem is even bigger than what's written down on paper. On the 8th of November alone, 11,000 Syrian refugees fled to 3 neighboring countries overnight due to the consistent conflict within Syria. This included about 9,000 people who fled to Turkey and 1,000 to Lebanon and Jordan, respectively. UNHCR reports that 6,100 Syrians have registered in Egypt, a substantial increase from the past months, where Egypt was not really common ground for refugees, but they were running out of options with where the Syrians could be displaced at this point. On average, 2,000 to 3,000 refugees cross the border daily, and crossing the border is becoming increasingly difficult for refugees given that access due to roadblocks is becoming a significant problem when it comes to transportation within Syria. 3/4 of the refugees that are seeking shelter in nearby countries are women and children, many of whom have suffered unbearable violence and abuse before they could flee the country. So these people are in very vulnerable states when seeking refuge, so what's offered to them in other countries needs to take the form of health, education, things that they're not getting within Syria itself right now. In En-Nabuk, 60 people from Homs are staying in tents on a former poultry farm. In Aleppo, more than 27,000 IDPs are hosted in cramped university dormitories. To meet the challenges of winter, these IDPs require warm clothing, heaters, blankets, and shelter rehabilitation. Thus, as you can see, the situation for refugees is not exactly ideal given the current resources that are being provided to them. Children make up about half of the Syrian refugee population, and in addition to needs such as shelter, food, and clothing, education is a growing concern among refugees. While neighboring governments and aid agencies are providing support to schools and child-friendly spaces, Save the Children has warned that up to 43,000 Syrian refugees are currently out of school in Lebanon and Iraq alone, not counting Jordan and Egypt, which are 2 other substantial refugee housings. On the 20th of October, El Qiyam border crossing to Iraq closed for Syrian refugees, which took a large toll on the Syrian refugee population because this left hundreds waiting to exit Syria. The border was previously open to women and children, but has since been reported to have closed except for medical cases and other urgent cases. And a lot of the reason for these border crossings to close is because of the lack of resources in these neighboring countries, as well as these roadblocks and the increasing lack of security around transportation systems within Syria.
What hindrances to the progressive process towards peace in Syria can be attributed to Russia's role?
Well, Syria and Russia have a long history when it comes to being allies. Syria is Russia's closest Middle Eastern ally, and in 1956, Syria allowed Egypt in acquiring arms from the Soviet Union. And the Suez War accelerated a multiplication of ties between Syria and the Soviet Union. So, over time, Syria and Russia's bond has become a lot stronger, which shows why Russia is somewhat reluctant to kind of aid the situation in Syria on the side of the opposition, because Russia's political presence in Syria predates the creation of the modern Syrian state after World War II. During the Cold War, even, Damascus served as an ally to Moscow in opposition to the Western powers, creating a stronger political bond. Western and Arab governments state that Russia is continuing to support the Syrian government led by President Bashar al-Assad, despite their call for condemnation amidst accusations that Assad's government has killed thousands of its own citizens in order to maintain control of the entire Syrian population. Russia's Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, in contrast, states that Russia does not support anyone in this conflict, neither President Assad nor the rebels. Russia continues to state that they're taking a neutral stance, but a lot of the actions that you can see on Russia's behalf does not represent a neutral stance whatsoever. He adds that Russia simply tells both sides that they must sit down at the negotiating table and come to an agreement, rather than shoot at each other, which is the worst possible scenario. Medvedev indirectly criticizes outside powers for their involvement in the civil war, stating that some countries have a more one-sided approach. This side must leave immediately, and we will send weapons to the other side. That's what he states that other countries are doing, which is not what he's in agreement with, considering he feels that Russia should take a neutral stance, which actually isn't what they're doing at all. Russia has at various times used its UN Security Council position to block resolutions that would condemn the Syrian government, including blocking the first and second drafts of a Franco-British sponsored attempt to condemn the use of force by the Syrian government. The vetoed issuance of the report in March had apparently contained material incriminating both the leadership of Iran and Syria in matters related to the transmission of arms to militant groups. The first and second drafts of the resolution, sponsored by France, the UK, Germany, and the US and Portugal, condemning the Syrian government, were opposed by Moscow because it was feared that they could lead to an interpretation by Western countries that would allow for interference in Syrian affairs similar to what occurred in Libya. Russia's main standpoint when it comes to Syria and not accepting these negotiations is the fact that Syria and Russia hold a strong tie when it comes to the provision of arms. Today, Russia is the world's second largest arms exporter behind the United States and lost $4 billion in Libyan contracts due to United Nations arms embargo in 2011. And according to reports, 2.4% of Russia's exports come from defense-related sales, so the recent Arab Spring conflict saw an uptick in sales to countries like Syria. Russia has been shipping large amounts of weapons to Bashar al-Assad, with one ship loaded with dangerous cargo, notably having to stop in Cyprus due to stormy weather on the 10th of January in 2012. Russia's current contracts with Syria for arms are estimated to be worth $1.5 billion US, comprising 10% of Russia's global arms sales. On June 1st, right after the Hula massacre in Syria, United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton singled Russia out, condemning Russia's alleged continuous supply of arms to Syria, and that in her view, Russia's stance in the conflict is clearly not as neutral as it claimed it was. In particular, there was ire over a report that Russia allegedly delivered arms to the Syrian port of Tartus the same week as the infamous massacre. This port also plays a large role in the political standpoint of Russia when it comes to the Syrian conflict, because Tartus is Russia's only Middle Eastern port that it has access to, which is extremely important when it comes to things like arms export and that kind of control. Critics say that the position of the naval base serves as a chief motivating factor for speaking out in favor of Assad regime to maintain stability in the region. So when it comes to export control and declining to ratify a lot of treaties proposed by UN and other Franco-British treaties that have been proposed, Russia has been a giant hindrance when it comes to creating the solution to the Syrian conflict.